There is a moment in the soul's journey when something quiet happens. It is not an explosion nor a mystical revelation. It is subtler, as if a part of us, tired of adapting, simply said, "Enough." Carl Jung called this moment the birth of the self, the point at which we stop living to please and begin to exist, to be. From then on, body and spirit start operating at a different rhythm. The soul, which once bowed before external demands, rises in silent dignity, not out of pride, but out of self-love in its purest form, reverence for one's own essence. Perhaps you have felt this, that strange mixture of fatigue and clarity when you realize that certain situations, people or conversations no longer fit your skin. There is no anger, only lucidity, as if something in you had developed a spiritual immune system, a sacred discernment that recognizes what elevates and what depletes, what nourishes and what drains. Jung said that true maturity is not tolerating everything, but learning to distinguish what serves the soul's expansion from what feeds unconsciousness. And paradoxically, the more conscious we become, the less we can endure what betrays the inner truth. In this video, we will walk together through 10 invisible boundaries that a matured spirit simply cannot cross anymore. Not out of judgment, but out of integrity. Because when consciousness expands, it no longer bows before what diminishes it. Stay with me until the end of this reflection, and tell me in the comments, in what area of your life has your soul already begun to stop bowing? Chapter 1. Energetic Violation and the Radar of Consciousness. There are encounters that seem harmless on the surface, but leave an invisible trail within us, as if something had been siphoned without permission. You talk, smile, try to be present, and when you say goodbye, you feel a weight you can't explain. This quiet exhaustion is one of the first signs that your consciousness has begun to distinguish what Jung called psychic invasion, the unconscious penetration of another's emotional field into our own vital energy. For a long time, we confused empathy with absorption. We believed that to hold space for another meant allowing their pain to take up residence inside us. But the matured soul learns, sometimes through sheer exhaustion, that compassion without discernment is a form of self-sabotage. Because when you hold another's suffering without them taking responsibility for their shadow, you don't help them grow. You only keep them from finding their own path. Jung said that the human unconscious is in constant search of balance. When a person refuses to face their pain, they instinctively try to deposit it into someone more sensitive. And the sensitive one, if they have not yet learned to protect themselves, becomes the involuntary container of that burden. That is how emotional vampirism is born, not as a conscious act of malice, but as a reflex of collective unconsciousness. Over time, the awakened soul develops something we might call an energetic radar, an instant perception of what is genuine and what is invasion disguised as vulnerability. This radar does not judge, it simply senses, and the body becomes its spokesperson. A tightness in the chest, a slight nausea, a sudden impulse to step back. These are the psyche's natural defenses, trying to preserve the inner space where the self dwells. Recognizing this movement is an act of sacred self-love. It is not about rejecting people, but about not allowing another's unconsciousness to colonize your soul. Spiritual maturity begins when you understand that carrying others' pain is not compassion. It is complicity with unconsciousness. Try a brief exercise now. Close your eyes for a few moments and recall a recent situation in which you left an encounter feeling drained. Breathe deeply and ask yourself, whose energy am I carrying? Allow your intuition to answer without overthinking. Then visualize yourself returning that energy to its source with respect and quiet, saying inwardly, "This does not belong to me." This symbolic gesture marks the beginning of emotional hygiene, an invisible ritual that strengthens your soul's boundary. For the cleaner your energetic field becomes, the clearer your inner listening grows. And from that clarity, discernment is born, the ability to love without losing yourself. Chapter 2. Manipulative Theatre and the Archetype of the Puer Aeternus. Not all pain asks for healing. Some merely want a stage, and when the awakened soul begins to see this, a peculiar discomfort arises, watching people perform suffering to gain control. It is at this point that compassion matures and becomes discernment. Carl Jung observed that the unconscious has a natural tendency toward dramatization. When an emotion is not understood, it seeks expression through gestures, crises, and performances. Thus is born what he called the inflated persona, a mask that simulates vulnerability but actually seeks to maintain power over the other. Behind the forced tears or theatrical fragility dwells the archetype of the Puer Aeternus, the eternal adolescent who refuses to grow up. The pure wants to be loved but not held accountable, wants to be understood but not confronted, and unconsciously it turns each relationship into a stage where the other must play the role of savior. When you awaken, you perceive this dynamic with unsettling clarity. It is like watching a play whose ending you already know, and within you something simply refuses to applaud. Spiritual maturity recognizes that participating in this theater is not kindness, it is shared stagnation. While the pure seeks escape in drama, the inner adult seeks integration. The difference is vast. Drama demands an audience. Healing happens in silence. It is painful at first to step out of the savior role. The ego fears appearing cold, distant, or insensitive. But in truth, what is being born is real love, the kind that does not confuse empathy with complicity. Jung said that the most compassionate act is allowing the other to face their own shadow, and that confrontation only happens when we stop offering a stage to the unconscious. Perhaps you know someone like this, who repeats the same emotional plots, who feeds on constant crises, who turns every wound into a spectacle. Or perhaps you notice this pattern within yourself, the need to be seen through pain. In both cases, the invitation is the same. Leave the theater and return to the temple. Leave the stage of suffering and return to the inner space where silence speaks louder than any scene. Try a brief moment of reflection. Think of a relationship in which you have felt this emotional fatigue, as if you were the spectator of a never-ending drama. Breathe deeply and ask yourself, what role am I playing here that I no longer wish to perform? There is no need for immediate answers, only awareness, because when you recognize the script, the spell breaks. And what remains is freedom, to love without being captured by the theater of the unconscious. Chapter 3. Not sacrificing the self, authenticity over approval. Plus, immunity to chronic depreciation. There's a kind of pain that disguises itself as kindness, shrinking yourself to fit. For years, many of us learned that being loved meant being convenient. Swallowing truths, smiling when we wanted to scream, faking lightness when everything inside felt heavy. And little by little, we became characters in the story others wrote about us. But there comes a moment when this performance becomes unbearable. The soul, tired of trading its light for acceptance, decides to break the invisible contract that kept it imprisoned. This is the beginning of individuation, the process Jung described as the birth of the authentic being, rising from the ashes of conformity. When you begin to honor your essence, the world, accustomed to your docility, reacts. Some will call you selfish, others cold or distant, but deep down it is only the old system trying to survive. Your light, now non-negotiable, threatens the balance of relationships based on accommodation, and at this point, something very important happens. You develop immunity to chronic depreciation. The little pinpricks, the ironic comment, the compliment disguised as criticism, the silence that tries to belittle, stop penetrating. Not because you have hardened, but because your worth no longer depends on external approval. Jung said that mature consciousness establishes a self-regulating function of the self. It is when the psyche recognizes its own dignity and no longer needs the world to confirm it. Notice, people threatened by your authenticity often resort to subtle devaluation. They don't shout, they insinuate, they don't attack, they corrode. It is the ego's unconscious movement, fearing it will disappear before the other's integrity. Spiritual maturity, however, does not defend itself with counterattacks. It simply withdraws in silence, not as an escape, but as fidelity to its own vibration. Try a simple practice. Take a notebook and write at the top of the page, "Where did I betray myself yesterday?" Then jot down the small concessions you made, a swallowed opinion, a boundary ignored, a truth silenced. And below write, "I shall allow myself to return to myself." There is no guilt in this gesture, only return, because each time you choose yourself, the entire universe reorganizes around that decision. The matured soul understands. Pleasing is easy, but costly. Being true is demanding, but it sets you free. And when you choose authenticity over approval, you begin to radiate a peace no applause can offer. The price of integrity is high, but the cost of self-betrayal is immeasurable. Chapter 4, Sacred Boundaries and the Return of Projections. There are invisible boundaries that, when respected, preserve the soul's temple. They are not walls raised by fear, but contours drawn by consciousness. Jung called this space the psychic territory, the sacred ground where the self blooms when protected from the invasions of the collective unconscious. For a long time, we confused love with total availability. We left doors open for those who did not know how to enter in silence. We explained our boundaries to those who never intended to understand them. And thus, little by little, we allowed the world to step into our interior with feet soiled by urgency. But spiritual maturity arrives like a change in frequency. Suddenly, it is no longer possible to endure the invasion of what wounds inner peace. Consciousness creates subtle antibodies that almost instinctively reject everything that threatens to dissolve the self's integrity. You begin to feel, not to think. A quiet resistance arises when someone tries to cross what is sacred. It is the body saying, "Not here." Jung said that the psyche has the same instinct of self-defense as the body, and that is exactly it. The inner system senses the violation before the rational mind understands what is happening. Some call it intuition. Jung called it archetypal wisdom. It is the soul preserving its vital space. But there is another subtle aspect, projections. When someone refuses to recognize their own shadow, they try to deposit it onto us. Accusations, judgments, distorted interpretations. And if we are unconscious, we absorb that psychic material as if it were ours. The matured soul, however, learns to return it, not with aggression, but with lucidity, with the inner gesture that says, "This belongs to you." This returning is one of the purest forms of love, because it spares you from emotional contamination and offers the other the opportunity to confront their own truth. Refusing to carry what is not yours is the beginning of true compassion. As Jung said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And no one can do that work for another." Try a brief practice now. Close your eyes and recall a recent situation in which someone projected a heavy emotion onto you. Guilt, anger, inferiority. Feel that energy in your body and visualize it loosening, like smoke returning to its origin. With respect and serenity, repeat silently, "I release what is not mine, and I return to the other the right to grow with their own shadow." When you perform this inner gesture, the energetic field around you expands. Boundaries become luminous, not rigid, and the silence that follows is the sound of the soul breathing in peace. Chapter 5. Leaving the stage of repetitive drama and superficiality. There are cycles that repeat with near ritual precision. The same words, the same conflicts, the same missed connections, only with new settings and different faces. Jung called these movements autonomous complexes, little worlds within us that repeat until they become conscious. And as long as we have not awakened, we keep taking part in the same plays, believing them to be new stories. Spiritual awakening reveals this pattern like turning on a light in an old room. Suddenly, the plot is obvious. The victim, the savior, the persecutor. Roles switching, predictable lines, identical endings. And in that instant, sacred intolerance is born, not toward the person, but toward the repetition. The matured soul simply can no longer act in the same drama that kept it asleep. At first, this decision may seem cold. You stop reacting, stop explaining yourself, stop entering the scene. But in truth, you are offering something far more powerful, the absence that heals. For without an audience, the drama loses meaning. Without a response, the complex dissolves, and what remains is silence, the space where the unconscious can finally hear itself. This same lucidity extends to superficial interactions. After tasting authenticity, shallow conversations become indigestible. It is not arrogance, it is the soul's physiology. Your vibration, now more refined, rejects the emptiness disguised as socializing. Jung said that the persona, the social mask, is necessary but lethal when it dominates the whole being. And the person in the process of individuation feels, almost physically, when speaking to masks instead of souls. Perhaps you have felt this. A meeting where everyone smiles, but no one is present. A conversation full of words, yet lacking truth. These moments produce a different kind of fatigue, a boredom that is not laziness but longing for depth. The matured soul seeks what is real, even if it is simple, even if it hurts. It prefers sincere silence to a soulless dialogue. And it learns, over time, that it is not its role to save anyone from superficiality, only to live so truthfully that example itself becomes an invitation. Try a small practice now. Before each encounter, take a deep breath and ask yourself, am I going for presence or out of habit? If the answer is presence, go wholeheartedly. If it is habit, perhaps silence will serve you better. Because when you leave the stage of drama and refuse the banquets of superficiality, you discover another kind of communion, the one that happens when two souls recognize each other without words. And it is in that space that life becomes real again and sacred. Chapter 6. Farewell to mediocrity and the self-betrayal of one's own evolution. There comes a point in the journey when the soul will no longer accept remaining where the spirit has already departed. It is the moment when comfort begins to suffocate, and the familiar, once safe, becomes too small for the size consciousness has reached. Jung said that the self, this living center of the psyche, has a natural impulse toward wholeness. When the soul awakens, there is no going backward without getting sick. Mediocrity in this context is not a lack of talent, but a lack of presence. It is living on autopilot, repeating gestures, playing roles, pretending to be satisfied. And for the being in individuation, this repetition is no longer bearable. Because the soul, once expanded, no longer fits old forms. It demands coherence between what is felt and what is lived, between what is known and what is chosen. This refusal of mediocrity is not born of ego, but of reverence. You begin to understand that life is a gift, and to treat it carelessly is a form of desecration. Work that does not reflect your truth, relationships that do not grow, conversations that do not awaken, all of it begins to generate a kind of spiritual asphyxia. It is the self asking for air. And to deny that call is to betray your own evolution. Jung said that when the soul ignores what it knows, it creates symptoms, Apathy, emptiness, and deep fatigue are not enemies, they are messengers. They announce that something within us is being denied, and healing begins when we stop interpreting these signs as weakness and start listening to them as guidance from the unconscious. Then allow yourself to notice, where have you remained out of fear of growing? In what area of your life are you continuing to play roles that have already lost their meaning? The soul does not demand grand revolutions. Sometimes a small gesture is enough, an honest conversation, a more aligned choice, a timely silence. Every act of authenticity, however small it seems, reinforces the bridge between the human and the divine in you. And then something mysterious happens. Life begins to respond. Jung called this synchronicity, the way the universe reorganizes events when the individual begins to live in accordance with their center. It is as if reality said, "Now that you've stopped betraying yourself, I can walk beside you." The matured soul understands that excellence is not perfection. It is full presence in what you do, conscious devotion to what you live. And when you honor that presence, everything around you aligns. People, paths, opportunities. Because the universe recognizes the vibration of truth and answers it with quiet generosity. Conclusion. Sacred discernment, less concession, more presence. We have arrived at the point where all boundaries become one. Reverence for one's own soul. It is not about rigidity, nor about isolation. It is a higher form of love, a love that has finally learned to include oneself. Jung said that the process of individuation is not the path to becoming perfect, but to becoming whole. And wholeness requires choices. It requires saying no to what fragments, so that the yes to what is true can bloom. When we stop tolerating what diminishes us, we are not turning away from the world. We are drawing closer to what is real within it. The matured soul discovers that compassion without discernment is complicity with unconsciousness, and that silence, when born of clarity, is more healing than 1,000 attempts at explanation. Therefore, as we evolve, we feel less need to convince and a greater desire to be whole, to be authentic, to be faithful to what the heart already knows. This is the true miracle of spiritual maturity, realizing that every boundary raised out of self-love is in fact an offering to life. For when you protect what is sacred within you, you create space for the divine to move without noise. Your energy, once scattered in unnecessary battles, concentrates in presence. And presence is prayer in motion. So take a deep breath and allow this truth to settle. You no longer need to bow to be good, nor empty yourself to be loved. The soul that has learned to discern between what expands and what imprisons is already at peace with the essential. If this content has touched something in your journey, share in the comments. Which patterns did your soul stop tolerating when it began to awaken? Your words may echo in other hearts, still seeking the same homecoming.